Welcome, everyone. I'm joined today by Armen Nurbekyan, Deputy Governor at Armenia Central Bank. Mr. Nurbekyan, thank you very much for your time.
Mark, thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. I'd like to start with inflation. Armenia experienced unusually high levels of inflation last year, with particularly strong pressure on prices for food and other essentials. In a statement last week, the IMF noted that Armenia's consumer price inflation rate peaked last June at 10.3%, and by last month had declined to 5.4% year on year. Also last month, the central bank decided to leave its key refinancing rate unchanged at 10.75%, a move that many observers have read as a signal that the bank believes inflation will continue decelerating this year. What else can you add about this?
Inflation issue is really important, and as you know, price stability is the main mandate for the Central Bank of Armenia by constitution. We need to step back to be able to analyze the inflation patterns well and to understand what is the underlying narrative for our economy. Indeed, as you mentioned, in 2021 and 2022, we had a very high inflation, and this was the case for the whole world as well, on many factors, both strong demand and strong fiscal and monetary stimulus around the world, as well as commodity price shocks that we observed because of the COVID. And in case of Armenia, what happened is that we reacted as a central bank very quickly in a forward-looking manner. We were one of the first in the world which reacted to the high inflationary pressure, expected inflationary pressure in December of 2020, right? This is important because the forward-looking policy framework that we have means that we do not have to see the problems actually coming in order to react, but we actually can react before we are forward-looking in our policy making. Having said that, because of the forward-looking nature of our policy, what happened is that in 2022 already, we had a declining inflation, and our inflation levels were much lower if compared to the peer countries, and actually in the world. And of course, in February, inflation after the events in Ukraine and Russia increased again, and then around 9%, and then started to decelerate again. Having said that, indeed, the inflation number has gone down during the last month. It's now 5.4%. But that masks a massive uncertainty and heterogeneity under that number. The reason is because much of the inflation which went down is because of the international commodity prices. But at the same time, if you look at the more sticky or core measures of inflation, which are really good markers for strong demand in the country and inflation expectations per se, we still see that these measures of inflation, notably services inflation, is quite strong above the target. And one thing I want to mention that our inflation has a 4% target, and plus minus 1.5 percentage point is really a variation, but our target is 4%. And this was, by the way, envisioned in our latest monetary policy report and the one before. If you look at the report, you can see that this decline in inflation was actually expected by the central bank.
And so I know that it's always kind of a tricky game but to forecast, but what can we expect from this year in terms of inflation, in your view?
Yeah, in the latest monetary policy report, as I mentioned, we already published our projections, and we will see some softness in inflation in coming months as well, and this year we'll hit the target of 4%.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask about Armenia's currency, the dram. So last year we also witnessed very strong appreciation by the dram against the dollar and euro. That prompted serious concerns from export-oriented companies and IT firms in Armenia, which saw their profits decline as a result. Nonetheless, the central bank repeatedly ruled out intervening in the currency market, arguing it would further worsen inflation. So fast forward to now, is the central bank still concerned about the dram's continued relative strength?
It is a very important question, and in fact, when we talk about the currency and the exchange rate, it is paramount to understand why is the exchange rate moving. The common mistake which is made is to think of an exchange rate as a cause for things. But the exchange rate is a result of the economic realities that we have. In this particular case, what central bank has been communicating is that exchange rate is a result of very strong external demand that we see. And you can see this in the growth numbers. We had 12.6% growth in 2022, which is very high, much higher than central bank expected and pretty much everybody expected. You look at the exports, you look at the current account balance, you can see that clearly exchange rate reflects the fundamental factors behind our economic growth. So this is really important because when we frame the question in terms of the exchange rate and exports, we draw a causality from exchange rate to the exports, but in real life, what happened is our exchange rate is strong because our exports have been very strong. And this is pretty much in what you can see in statistics. Now, what happens is that in terms of the ruling count interventions, in fact, central bank intervened quite heavily in the market. So we intervened more than $1 billion. And if you look at our reserves, our FX reserves, they're at historic heights. But the reason we intervene is not because we have any preferred rate of exchange rate. There is no level that we prefer. The reason we intervene is because we had very high flows, both capital and real flows, into the country. And because our market is shallow, it means that sometimes there is a higher risk that it will freeze because it just cannot naturally absorb these flows. So central bank there intervenes to make sure that there is a proper market functioning without, very important, without signaling any price level. This is really important because whenever central bank signals a preference for any exchange rate, that destroys the market and totally changes the game and expectations. But I want to reiterate that central bank has been intervening, but making sure that there is no fundamental change to the expected level exchange rate because of the FX intervention that we made. Second thing, just to make an example of this causality, which is very important, that the FX currency rate is actually a result of strong exports, and IT is a very good example. What we do as a central bank, we actually track the currency flows, right? So if exchange rate appreciates, if Armenian dram appreciates, it means there are more dollars or more foreign currency, and somebody has to generate and sell it, and somebody has to buy it. So we actually track the sectors which sell the dollars and buy the dollars. What you can actually see that IT companies and IT sector is one of the main sectors which was selling the dollars in the internal market. That has been, if you look at the scales, just for you to understand what are the numbers. So the net amount of dollars and foreign currency that IT sector was generating and selling in our FX market is 5 or 6 times higher compared to the pre-February. That is why when we talk about exchange rate, it's really important for us to make sure that the causality is correct. Because if we treat the symptoms, but we don't treat the real disease, then we are going to have big problems in terms of our policy consistency.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I also wanted to talk about Armenia's commercial banks, which recorded a net inflow of more than $2.5 billion last year in individual transfers from abroad, largely from Russia. Importantly, most Armenian banks have also continued processing Russia's mere payment cards, despite secondary sanctions warnings from the US Treasury Department. Late last year, a spokesperson told CivilNet that the central bank does not plan on forcing commercial banks in Armenia to halt mere payments, saying, and I'm quoting now, Armenian commercial banks independently manage their risks, including those related to sanctions. Does that remain the central bank's position?
The very first message that I want to reiterate is that compliance is a key priority for the central bank and commercial banks and financial systems as a whole. And there is no change whatsoever in terms of the prioritizing the compliance issues. So our financial sector has to be staying away from all types of secondary or any other types of sanctions. That's the very first message that I want to reiterate. The message of MIR and other associated systems is that we have many Armenians who live in Russia, which means that it is a very natural process that we make sure that all our fellow citizens can get the proper services in Armenia or in Russia. At the same time, we have been very careful to make sure that we do not get under the radars and we do not have any problems with the sanction. That is why the issue with the MIR is organically separated from any types of opportunistic commercial behavior.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask about the Armenia Securities Exchange, which, for those who do not know, is Armenia's sole stock exchange. In 2020, the Warsaw Stock Exchange acquired a 65% majority interest in the exchange from the central bank to the tune of about $1.9 million. Since then, though, it appears, at least publicly, that there have been a few major developments on this front. We haven't heard a lot about this. So what updates can you give us? And in your view, why have Armenia's capital markets been so slow to develop?
It's a very good question, but maybe before I go to the stock exchange, I want to also touch the points about banks which are not compliance per se and not sanctions related, because I think it's really important to get the full narrative.
Absolutely.
What happened is that last year our banking system, as you mentioned, had unprecedented very high inflows, and on back of that inflows, our banking system has been very profitable. We as a central bank made sure that we use these profits for making sure that the fundamentals of the banking system stay strong. And that is why we as a central bank increased our counter-cyclical capital buffers, which is basically a buffer which is made by the banking system in case something, a negative event and downturn happens. So we increased the counter-cyclical buffer by 1.5 percentage point, and it will approximately be around 90 billion drams. So our capital buffers have been increased on back of this development. That is why I wanted to make sure that I send the same message as I did for the price stability. It's exactly the same applies for financial stability. We make sure that we use good times for accumulating the buffers, because as you mentioned, uncertainty is very high. There, as I'm sure you and I can imagine more than one scenario in all directions. That is why we make sure that the banking system is stable and we use this high profits wisely. Now going to the stock exchange. Indeed, stock exchange is very important infrastructure for Armenia. The reason that we are working with the Warsaw Stock Exchange, because we want to benefit from their experience. They're one of the leading stock exchanges in Europe. They are quite advanced technologically, so we want to use that experience for Armenian Stock Exchange as well. The key priorities for the central bank in terms of the stock exchange is, of course, using the governance and governance standards and technological developments that Warsaw Stock Exchange have. The second and most important thing that we are thinking about, and our board members at the stock exchange communicate, is that we have to make sure that fundamental infrastructure is in place. Because if you want to develop stock markets or long money markets, you need first to make sure that the safest parts of the market function well, and in our case is money market, government bond markets, and FX market. Because if you don't have the safest places working well, you have no hope that the long or more riskier like stocks are going to be a liquid position. That is why the key priorities now that we work on is the short-term money market rate and FX markets to make sure that it's competitive, and we make sure that the infrastructure is key. To give you an example that infrastructure is so important is that Armenian bond market, government bond markets, is integrated with the Clearstream link. Clearstream is a company which provides these pipes for investors to do the clearing and settlement of the bonds or other types of papers. So because Armenia is fundamentally integrated into Clearstream through the exchange, stock exchange, that is why our foreign investors have a very easy access to our bond markets, government bond markets. I was in the US for IMF and World Bank spring meetings, and there was a lots of enthusiasm for our bond markets. So that is why for us, in terms of the stock exchange, the key priority is to develop the short end, which is a precondition for developing the longer end. The first official board meeting after the acquisition of the shares of the IMX have happened a month ago. The strategy was discussed, and we have very good expectations that they will deliver on our expectations.
Okay, great. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Finally, I'm just wondering, a theme that's come up repeatedly in our conversation is this idea of unpredictability. And you were talking as well about the central bank pursuing a policy that is proactive rather than reactive. I was wondering if you could just expand on that and tell us more about what the current thinking is at the bank.
This is a real good opportunity for me because we are actually in the process of changing our monetary policy framework, which is based on risk management. Because fundamentally, the world is unpredictable, as you mentioned, and to condition all the policy on a baseline scenario is very difficult and it's very risky. So What we do instead, we try to make sure that we imagine several scenarios and we do a proper risk management for the central bank monetary policy. We're now in the process of formalizing it, but this played a very big role in our decisions during the last 2 years. Because think about it, in March of 2022, very short time after February 24th, we had a board decision to make. And who can tell at that point what will happen? So that is why unpredictability is something that central banks have to put as an integral part of their frameworks. And we as the Central Bank of Armenia are doing it. And fundamentally, our policy is based on imagining the scenarios which could happen. Right now is a very similar situation because, as you can see in the media and everywhere, people are saying, oh, are these flows going to continue, or are we going to see a reversal? So how do you make decision in this kind of environment? Because any prediction you make, it's almost 100% you are going to be wrong. That is why, from our point of view, what we try to do the risk management. And that is why, for example, when I was talking about inflation going down, I was also mentioning what are the key risks. That we may see that inflation is going down, but at the same time, we may see that some core part of it, which is the strong demand component, is still strong. So your question is absolute key. Keep watching us. In our monetary policy reports, we try to make sure that we expand on this issue. In fact, in the latest monetary policy report, we have scenarios there where we show the public what would happen, for example, if there were other developments of the exchange rate and how much the central bank would need to increase the interest rates to have the same inflation now. So again, this goes to the same point. So we communicate with our public in a transparent way so they understand what are our policy decisions.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Nurbekyan, thank you again very much for taking the time to have such an interesting and thoughtful conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.